Prologue. Longwood House breathed damp. The Atlantic crept through every crack, salted the ink and softened the paper with a patient, invisible hand. The wind, tireless and impartial, rattled shutters and combed the coarse grass that lay like a faded regiment spread upon the hill. He had learned the cadence of that wind, the steady drum that reminded him, always, that there was a world beyond the horizon, and that it no longer belonged to him. Napoleon rose before the house did. Habit, not necessity, brought him from bed. No aide stood with dispatches, no sentry stamped his boots in the frost. He dressed without ceremony. The old grey greatcoat worn at the cuffs, a plain waistcoat, a neckcloth he tied too quickly. He took the bicorn from the peg and held it briefly, as if weighing it against the morning, then set it down again. The hat meant something out there, in the minds of men. Here it was merely felt and memory. "Your tea, sire," said Marchand, soft-footed, careful with porcelain. One still called him sire. The word persisted like a scent in a closed room. Napoleon nodded, glanced at the steam spiralling up, and did not drink. He moved to the window instead. The glass was imperfect. The horizon wavered. The sea was the colour of iron, flecked with gulls, and a single speck that might have been a ship, or a thought one could not shake. He had planted willows below the house, thin green whips, no promise to them yet, but he liked the idea of shade where the wind allowed none. He had come, in these months, to think kindly of small beginnings, a meek shoot pushing through poor soil, a sentence that sounded thin until the next one arrived to buttress it. He had misread beginnings before, confused them with foregone conclusions. Now he let them be small. At the desk the pages lay in neat stacks, weighted with a paper knife. Las Cases would come soon with his polite cough, and the patient instrument of his pen. "If you permit, sire, where were we?" "The crossing to Egypt." Napoleon heard the question before it was asked and answered it anyway, in the empty room to the empty sea. "We were in Brienne," he said. The word itself laid a frost on the floorboards. Brienne. A courtyard of packed snow, boys shouting in a language he spoke too precisely, his Corsican tongue cleaving vowels at angles that made them laugh. A small boy set a snow fort against a hillside and defended it with uncommon ferocity, broadside after broadside of ice. They called him miserly with smiles and prodigal with plans. He remembered writing home that winter, telling his stern mother that France was a place you endured before you commanded it. He smiled now, faintly. "We were in Brienne," he repeated. "I learned to be alone there. It is a useful skill." When he sat, the chair gave a tired groan. He picked up the paper knife and balanced it across 2 fingers, a tiny bridge. There were bridges everywhere in his memory, crossings taken, crossings burned. The room held its breath. A fly scraped its miniature boots along the pane. He closed his eyes and the light became cloth, heavy on his lids, the colour of trumpet brass. He had learned on campaign the trick of turning a tent into a map. Canvas walls, wind, the smell of leather and tallow. He placed a nation on the tabletop, then another beside it, and drew with his mind the quick lines that would change their shapes. There had been nights when he and his marshals bent over those maps like conspirators at a card table, the stakes measured in provinces and harvests. He had liked those nights. He had liked the brisk certainty of them. He had liked being right. Of the many words his enemies used for him, he found the wrong ones lingered longest in the ear. Ogre, usurper, little corporal, said kindly and unkindly both. He was not little among his men. He was little among kings. It amused him still that the latter had mattered more. "Your Excellency," Las Cases stood at the door, hat against his chest, eyes sober and shining as if the task were a mass. He was a good man and a tireless scribe. He stepped in, drew up a chair, uncapped the ink with reverence. "Shall we continue?" "We shall begin," Napoleon said. He liked the sound of it. It was a small rebellion to begin each day anew. "Write this. Memory is a battlefield. It favours the bold as surely as the fog does." The pen whispered. Outside, a far-off horse snorted. Someone from the garrison, perhaps, cutting across the lower fields, and a dog barked and thought better of it. Napoleon folded his hands, knuckles like knots of ivory, and let the first line lead to the second. On an island called Corsica, which smelled always of rosemary and powder, a boy learned that a name can be a flag. He learned to hold it above his head and above his hunger. He learned that to read is to steal fire, and that the ones who keep the books are not always the ones who deserve them. Las Casas looked up, surprised, pleased. Poetic, sire. Don't say poetic, Napoleon said, but without heat. Say true. He had wanted truth all his life, and had often confused it with victory. He remembered a morning mist clearing from a valley near Austerlitz, and the sun breaking the ice on the ponds as the Russians plunged in. He remembered the glitter of bayonets like a field of frost flowers. He remembered the sound a nation makes when it kneels and when it stands, and how similar those sounds can be if you're not listening closely. The ink dried quickly today. The air had teeth. He touched the page. His fingertip came away clean. He thought of the road to Moscow, the way it did not end at the city but began there. He felt again the winter gnawing at the bone, the horses falling like doors closing themselves, the old guard breathing smoke and stubbornness into a sky that would not answer. He had learned then that courage was not a charge. It was a refusal. "We will tell them about Egypt," Las Casas prompted gently, the way one might remind a friend to eat. "The institute you founded, the scholars, the stone with 3 scripts." "We will," Napoleon said, "but not as a catalogue." He gestured toward the window where the horizon had sharpened into a blade. "We will tell them that a man can stand in the shadow of a pyramid and feel as small as the dot at the end of a sentence. We will tell them that the desert erases a footprint as easily as a signature." He reached for the tea and drank, finding it bitter and human. He had grown used to bitterness. It was an honest flavour. Marchand hovered, adjusted the fire, retreated. The room settled into its work, pen, breath, wind. He had considered, when they first brought him here, whether silence might serve him better. Let them speak. Let the English write their indignant lines. Let the Bourbons arrange their dull little victories on a mantle and dust them once a week. His legend, he thought, would ripen unattended, like fruit left out of reach. But legends left alone were like gardens left to wildness. Ivy overran the path, brambles built a civilization of thorns. He had never been a man to leave a path unmapped. "Write this also," he said. "A man is not the sum of his victories. He is the space his defeats hollow out and the shape he makes to fill it." Las Casas blinked, wrote. The pen scratched. A modest sword. Napoleon rose, went to the window again. The speck on the water had resolved into a cutter, small and white-topped like a gull's back. He watched it tack and tack again, making its way not directly but decisively. There were many ways across a hostile sea. He had tried most of them. Out on the slope a single willow made a thin hiss as the wind combed its narrow leaves. He imagined it broad one day, its shadow a clean ellipse on the grass. He imagined, he allowed it, the plot beside it, the stone, the rumour of cool roots wrapping a memory whole. The thought did not repulse him. It arranged him. "Shall we speak of the abdication?" Las Casas asked. "Fontainebleau?" Napoleon considered the word. Fontainebleau brought the smell of beeswax and old wood, the hands of his veterans rough on the guard of his carriage, the long corridor that taught a man how far a single step can be. He had said farewell and meant it. He had said farewell and did not. The human heart, he had learned, is a parliament without a speaker. "Not yet," he said. "We will not begin at endings. We will begin with a boy who counted ships and made his sums in hunger. We will begin with the first time he realized that orders are a language, and that he was born fluent." He turned back to the desk and set his hand on the paper, the way one sets a hand on a map to keep it from flying off in a sudden gust. Las Casas waited, attentive as a priest at the rail. The house creaked. The island made its ancient, indifferent noises. Napoleon breathed in the damp, the tea, the faint ghost of powder that lived wherever he stood long enough to remember. "Write," he said, and the pen obeyed. "Write as if the world has forgotten how to count and we must teach it again. Write as if the horizon can be persuaded. Write as if history were not a verdict but a summons." He paused. The wind faltered, resumed. "And if they ask who speaks," he added, not unkindly, "tell them it is a man who once commanded armies, and now commands only sentences. Tell them he has learned the difference. Tell them he prefers at last the harder task." Childhood and youth. Corsica was a cradle of stone and wind. In Ajaccio the sea spoke first, then the mountains answered, and the town between learned to live by listening. The boy was born there in August, when figs split with their own sweetness, and powder smoke sometimes hung over the harbour, after a quarrel between men with more pride than ships. They named him Napoleon Bonaparte, and even the name carried the island's rough music. His mother, Letizia, had hands that did not tremble. She ran the house like a campaign, accounts neat, shoes lined in pairs, children counted at dusk as if they were standards after a battle. "We have no gold," she would say, tying a belt around a small waist, "so we will have order." His father, Carlo, moved with the quickness of a man always on the brink of success. He courted patrons, petitioned offices, signed his name in a script that leaned forward as if it were already late. From him the boy took ambition like a fever. From her he learned that discipline is a way of loving. Corsica had passed from Genoa to France not long before, and men on the island spoke of it as one speaks of weather, inevitable, aggravating, sometimes fatal. There were evenings when lamplight pooled on the table and grown men, their wine thin and their voices not, argued the name of freedom until the word meant only their own faces. Pasquale Paoli, the island's great rebel, floated through those conversations like a saint in a stained-glass window. The boy listened. He set the syllables of Paoli in his mouth and liked the taste. Law, honour, a republic of Corsicans who would not bend. He was small for his age and hard to move. When other children sickened and yielded to bed, he lay still and outweighted fevers as if they were foolish captains. He liked numbers for their obedience and stories for their disobedience. He would sit in the shade of a wall, plaster warm, lizards stitching the surface with delicate feet, and read Plutarch as if the lives were news. He followed the marches of Alexander along the ragged edge of the Mediterranean, then looked up at the same colour of water and thought, not for the last time, that maps were simply promises someone had decided to keep. The island taught him 2 languages, Italian at home, French at school, each making the other sound slightly foreign. That foreignness would follow him onto ships and into rooms. It would cause laughter later, the Broadway hiss of Parisian boys, but on the island it only braided him tighter to his own name. "A name is a flag," Letizia told him when he bristled at a slight from a neighbour. "Hold it high, or it will drop and drag." He left Corsica at 9, small and solemn in a coat too large for him, the ferry's board sticky with brine. He watched the town slip behind the stern like a piece of handwriting he had not finished. The voyage to France felt like trespass. He kept a hand on his trunk as if the sea might make a claim on it. When a wave broke white and loud, he pretended not to flinch. Brienne Le Chateau did not care that he was from an island. Brienne cared about silence at vespers, the exact angle at which a bed should be made, the Latin that must be conjugated whether a boy's head ached or not. The cold there had a different logic than Corsican wind. It did not sing, it only took. He spoke French with an accent that made his classmates smile into their collars. He learned not to ask them to stop. He learned to count their laughs like volleys and to conserve ammunition. There is a way of being alone in a room full of boys. He mastered it. Winter made generals of children. In the courtyard the snow came in fine powder that scoured cheeks and puckered fingers. The boys set about the ancient work of building and defending. He did not run fastest or throw best. He stood a little apart and looked at the ground. "Here," he said, and tapped the packed snow with a stick. "A ditch here, a low wall there, and watch the slope. Let their weight carry them." He placed the eager ones where eagerness would not ruin them, the sullen ones where simple work would cure their sulk. When the mock battle began, his fort held. The others charged as boys must, and the ditch broke their rush, and the wall multiplied their clumsiness, and they swore by saints or devils depending on their family's habit. He did not gloat. He took notes. He loved mathematics, not because it was clean, but because it was useful. Geometry was a way to get what you wanted out of the world without pleading for it. Latitude and distance, elevation and range. He found he could look at a hill and feel the weight of an imaginary cannon on its shoulder, the path a shot would take through air that was not as empty as it looked. His teachers saw a boy who finished problems quickly and then sat still, staring at nothing in a way that made them uneasy. He was not dreaming. He was laying out a field that would one day become a map. At night he wrote letters home in a careful hand that improved as his French did. He asked after the lemon tree by the wall, after his brother Joseph's cough, after the gossip of Ajaccio's small streets. He was not sentimental about the island, but he could not bear the thought of it changing without him. He told his mother he would make their name mean something on the mainland. He told no one else. At Brienne he learned the particular comfort of a small room, and a task set on the desk like a companion. He also learned suspicion, of laughter that came a beat late, of flattery that asked to be fed, of men who chose their friends as if choosing horses. He learned that a boy who is laughed at for his accent can command the same boys if he stops asking to be understood and starts giving orders that work. From Brienne he went to the École Militaire in Paris, the great city opening around him like a fan and hiding blades in its folds. Paris dazzled and bored him, often in the same hour. The salons were heat and perfume, and a kind of warfare in which nothing bled. He preferred the more honest calculation of the artillery yard, where horses snorted steam, and metal had the decency to ring when struck. The masters there thought him severe and quick. He thought them adequate and slow. He studied ballistics as if it were a language he already knew and had only to recall. He ate little because money was a campaign that always went badly. He sent most of what he had home, and after Carlo died, too early, in a bed that smelled of laudanum and helplessness, he sent more. His signature straightened. The buoyant lean of his father's hand did not survive him. In Paris he encountered France as an idea rather than merely a power. In books and in the murmuring crowds he began to hear a word that had not been meant for him, and now seemed to call him by name. Citizen. It came wrapped in other words, rights, sovereignty, nation, that were not maps and not sums but felt like both. He held them up to the light and rotated them, as he did cannon shot when judging for flaws. Valence gave him his first commission, the junior rank and the long coat. The company of men who smelled of leather and bread and tobacco. The serious kindness of sergeants who measure officers by their boots before their principals. There, the artillery was not a set of problems but a living beast. Wheels that stuck in ruts, powder that dampened when the weather turned sulky, gunners whose hands were a liturgy of habit. He learned the speed at which a battery moves when fear runs through it, and the slower, better speed at which it moves when a voice says, plain and unafraid, steady. He read Rousseau and argued with him in the margins. He copied out passages from Plutarch as if taking dictation from ghosts. He wrote small essays, on happiness, on honour, on the Corsican question, that were too sharp for his age and too sure for his experience. When a local girl smiled at him across a courtyard, he returned the smile, and then felt as if betrayed by his own face that he had wasted an evening. He wanted something larger than evenings. He wanted work that would make sleep feel earned. He returned briefly to Corsica after his studies, full of a young man's clean certainties. The island looked smaller and more itself. He met Paoli and discovered that statues talk like men, and that men disappoint you in ways statues cannot. He loved his island and reprimanded it, sometimes in the same breath. The island loved him back the way families do, conditionally, noisily, for the person they remember rather than the one standing there. In the narrow rooms of Valence, on nights when the wind carried the rattle of signboards and the smell of soup from poorer houses, he would light a candle and draw. Not landscapes, positions. A hill with a battery, a road with a culvert that could be blocked, a river with a ford that would betray itself by its plants. He was teaching his hand to move as quickly as his mind. He was also teaching himself the habit he would never lose, to make the battlefield fit on a table where his will could reach every corner. He did not yet shine, he gathered. The reputation of a careful officer with an impatient gaze went ahead of him by a few streets. He visited the library more than the café. He listened when veterans spoke of Austria and Prussia, as if discussing relatives everyone found tiresome. He learned the weight of French words in French mouths, and kept a part of himself speaking Italian in his head, as if to remind himself that a man can be two things at once and still arrive where he intends. The revolution began like distant thunder, and Parisians, practised in storms, turned their faces to the sky to judge whether to bring in the laundry. He watched, at first, with the cautious interest of a professional who senses that his profession is being called to the front of the stage. Then he felt the summons in his ribs. Citizen. Sovereignty. The map on his desk grew teeth. On a morning like many others, he put on his coat, took up his worn bicorn, and closed the door with the gentle authority of a man who expects to open many more. He was not yet the figure who would bend maps, or the exile who would plant willows against an unkind wind. He was a young officer with a good eye and a stubborn heart, walking toward a sentry that had decided, without telling him, to bear his initials. A scent. Toulon smelled of tar and panic. The harbour clenched a foreign flag, British guns nailed to French soil, and every alley of the town carried arguments like smoke. He arrived not as a hero, but as a captain of artillery with a thin face and a habit of looking at ground before people. The generals argued about honour. He asked for elevations and ranges. "If we take the heights," he said, tapping a map with a blunt finger, "the ships will take themselves." He sighted batteries where the rock bit the wind, dragged guns by night with ropes hissing over stone, and woke the dawn with metal. The enemy fleet shuddered, lifted anchor, tore itself free. The tricolour climbed a mast that had been forbidden to it. He did not cheer. He took notes. The Republic took note of him. In the ledger of the Revolution, where names rose and fell like prices, his line leaped, Brigadier General at 24. He wore the rank as if it were inevitable, though nothing in France was. A month later, the same hands that had raised him began to point elsewhere. Robespierre fell, and with him those who had stood near enough to catch either light or blood. Napoleon was arrested for a handful of cautious days, released with no mark but a new wariness. He found that fame in a storm is a sail and a target both. Paris grew hungry and sharp. Royalists, smelling a return they had not earned, tested the streets. The government, Directory in name, improvisation in practice, sent for a man who could make a sentence of artillery persuade a crowd. He stood at the window of a borrowed office and looked out at the long grey avenues, then down at the map where they were shorter. "Guns at Saint-Roch," he said. "Grape shot if they insist." When they insisted, he answered in the only grammar mobs respect. The city leaped back from its own bravado. The air smelled of powder, then rain. That afternoon he was given command of the Army of the Interior, and with it, rooms where power had the hushed voice of a valet. He met Josephine like a man who bumps a table and discovers the chessboard already set. She laughed with a warmth he had not expected to want. She had been loved before and knew the price of it. He had not, and did not. His letters to her burned so hot they lit the corners of his ambition. He married in a hurry, because he was always in a hurry, then left almost at once, south, to the army of Italy, where war paid in rags and promises. They called it an army because it moved together. It moved in shoes that opened at the toes and coats that remembered other owners. He assembled the officers in a farmhouse perfumed by damp straw and old garlic, and told them, without rhetoric, what hunger could be made to want. "We will not be strong," he said. "We will be faster. We will put our weight where theirs is weakest. We will be where they decided we could not be." In the morning he addressed the soldiers as if they were already heroes and offered them not bread but opportunity. A few muttered. Most lifted their heads as if he had placed a hand under each chin. He fought like a man solving a problem that refused to be impressed by reputation. Montenotte, millesimo, dego. He struck before the Austrians finished their sentences, then again before they recognized the grammar. At Lodi the river ran brown and sullen under a wooden bridge that seemed to belong to another century. The enemy guns spoke from the far bank, with the bored confidence of those who cannot imagine you will come at them across a narrow plank. He did. The air above the bridge turned to needles. Men hesitated, bent, surged. He went forward not because he wanted to be brave, but because he wanted them to be. Later he would remember the sound differently, a continuous tearing like cloth, then the sudden hush when the far bank became his. He crossed back at dusk and stood alone for a moment on the empty planks. Something in him, which had been careful until then, allowed itself a dangerous thought, that future and will are not separate words. He began to write Italy as if it were a book, and he the editor. Cities yielded or negotiated new names for themselves. Republics sprouted like spring growth from old monarchic roots, green and eager and unlikely to survive a frost. He sent art to Paris the way other generals sent money, and the capital learned the weight of marble again. He bargained with dukes as if they were merchants, and with merchants as if they were dukes, and he learned that victory consists as much in finding the line men will not cross as in pushing them over it. He failed too. Arcole nearly broke him. The little bridge, the stubborn Austrian fire, the swamp that drank strength as quickly as wine. He took up a flag and went forward because sometimes an army needs a simple picture more than a complex plan. They pulled him back with hands that would have obeyed if he had ordered them to let go. He did not order it. He ordered the attack to continue by another route, which is what courage looks like after noon. Mantua fell by degrees, then all at once. Wurmser and Alvinci learned his habits too late. Europe, which had been pronouncing his name with curiosity, began to say it with caution. In Campo Formio, at a table where maps lay like flattened beasts, he traded territories with an emperor and discovered that it is possible to love negotiation almost as much as battle. The Directory smiled and shifted in its chair. A man who can make peace is more dangerous than one who can only make war. Paris received him as if briefly remembering how to adore. Crowds poured their joy on him like warm water. He stood in it, polite and absent, already thinking elsewhere. England lay across the Channel like a dare that could not be accepted in the ordinary way. He proposed an extraordinary way. Egypt, with its sand and antiquity, would be a corridor. Strike at British trade, crown the enterprise in scholarship, make a bridge between conquest and civilization. He filled ships with soldiers and with savants who packed telescopes and arguments, and when Marseille fell astern, the decks acquired a humming anticipation, a superstition that this man's plans made even the wind consider its options. Alexandria's walls did not hold them long. The desert opened like a door that had not been knocked on in centuries. Outside Cairo, under a sun that flattened shadows to ink, he told his men what the age demanded of them without borrowing any of its monument's thunder. The Mamelukes came like a painted story, gold and silk and fearless speed, and broke on squares of bayonets that waited silent until silence was no longer useful. Cairo fell as cities do when they have been warned by history and refuse to listen. He entered with care and calculation, banned plunder with a glare, and set about founding an institute because he believed that knowledge wins differently but no less. The expedition acquired a second life in notebooks. Men drew beetles and lintels with equal attention. Hieroglyphs, which had been decoration for 2 millennia, began to imagine themselves as language again. A stone inscribed 3 ways came to light in a ditch, ordinary as a brick, indispensable as a key. He toured the new institution in a plain coat with dust still on it, and argued with Monge and Berthollet as if equations were campaigns. He liked their certainty and envied it. Longwood House had grown quiet in a way that was not only weather. The wind still worked the shutters. The sea kept up its slow grammar against the rocks. The willows he'd planted finally made a small shade that moved across the grass like a thoughtful hand. Inside, the rooms had narrowed to essentials: a bed, a chair, a table with papers that no longer expected to become orders. Then the news found him like a blade placed gently under the ribs. Nelson had come and broken the fleet at Aboukir Bay. The sea, which had carried them like a promise, became a wall. He was a general whose supply lines now ended in silence. He did not despair. He calculated. Syria might offer exit or glory. He marched that way along old Roman roads whose stones remembered sandals. At Jaffa, plague sowed its dark arithmetic among his men. He walked the ward because the living required a picture of fear confronted. Acre refused him like a word that will not be pronounced. The French guns did their methodical work, and the walls repeated their refusal until the method was exhausted. He retreated without tragedy, but with loss, which is the same work done backwards. At Aboukir, on land this time, the Turks came hard and confident and left their conviction on the field. He stood on a mild rise and watched French squares turn pressure into victory with a coolness that felt, in that moment, like a moral quality. He had learned to step through chaos as if crossing a threshold. It was a talent and a fate. France called to him, though no letter said so plainly. The government tottered. The war with Europe had become a long, sour chore. The Directory counted its own fingers and feared to find fewer each morning. He weighed duty against possibility and discovered they balanced at a point the word loyalty could not quite name. He left the army with orders that made his absence seem a form of presence, and sailed in a small, fast ship that trusted more to luck than sailcloth. The sea, remembering Nelson, let him pass. He landed at Fréjus with a handful of companions and the sort of welcome that belongs to men who have been turned into stories in their own absence. The countryside carried him shoulder to shoulder, inn to inn, like a lit taper up a staircase. Paris opened its usual fan. Salons with the latest opinions, corridors with the oldest conspiracies, doorways where CAS stood as if he had been carved to fit them. "We need a sword," said the abbé, whose thoughts were all angles. "You need a direction," Napoleon answered. and the room understood both statements as the beginning of a single sentence. He did not sleep much. He drew a small plan and folded it twice, as if to make it stronger. He visited men who did not know they had already agreed. He let his name do a portion of the work and saved his voice for the rest. Somewhere in a quiet house, Josephine arranged flowers and considered the difference between certainty and hope. Somewhere in a barracks, a sergeant told his men that Paris might ask them for something unusual, and that they would give it with the usual competence. Somewhere in the Luxembourg, the Directory failed to imagine tomorrow. He walked through the garden at dawn, a coat over his arm, the gravel accepting his steps without comment. The air smelled of chestnut and distant rain. He paused, not because he doubted, but because he liked to measure a day before he lifted it. The century he had been walking toward now stood still and looked back at him. He set his hat on his head, simple as beginning a sentence. Empire at its zenith. Notre Dame smelled of wax and cedar, and old prayers warmed again by breath. Banners climbed the stone like tame flames. Trumpets braided the air with a ceremony that wanted to be older than it was. The Pope sat in white like a quiet snowfall, a witness rather than an author. Napoleon, in a mantle heavy as a verdict, lifted the crown with both hands as if testing its truth. He set it on his own head, not in defiance of heaven, but in obedience to his own grammar, then touched a second circlet to Josephine's brow, gentle, deliberate, the way one affirms a pact already made in private. 1,000 candles agreed at once. Paris, which loved spectacle as proof, decided this was the proper shape of power, laurel, gold, and a man who did not wait to be named. Before this day he had already given the army new totems. On a grey field above Boulogne, he placed eagles in the hands of standard-bearers who would sleep beside them like guardians of a household god. Ranks knelt, wind worried the silk, the sea beyond the dunes looked like iron being forged. "Carry these where I cannot stand," he told them without embroidery. They cheered in the voice of men who preferred tasks to orations. England lay across the channel, unreachable by ordinary courage. He turned from the water and set his face inland, where maps obeyed. Government became his second army. In rooms lit not by torches but by lamps shaded for reading, he argued each article of a new civil code as if haggling over the placement of a battery. Property, marriage, inheritance. He made the law speak in sentences that a village mayor could understand and a judge could not easily evade. Prefects replaced provincial improvisation with the same clean lines he loved on a plan. Lycées opened their doors. Boys in cheap coats learned to sit up straight in the language of the state. The bank stabilized money the way a good quartermaster stabilizes appetite. A concorder folded religion back into public life without allowing altar or pulpit to command the parade ground. He did not worship order for its own sake. He worshipped what order allowed him to build. Then the army lifted its head. In 1805 the camp at Boulogne dissolved into motion, and the road east filled with the sound of shoes that knew their work. At the edge of Moravia, mist stitched the low ground, and the Pratzen heights stood like a raised eyebrow. He let the enemy call him timid, let them come down to crush a retreat that did not exist. When the sun finally shouldered the fog aside, it looked like an omen hired for the hour. "Now," he said, "only that," and Soult's men moved up as if climbing a thought. The centre split. The wings groped for each other and found only air. On the frozen ponds below, cannonballs broke the surface like arguments, and the ice swallowed what it did not convince. By afternoon the field belonged to him, and to the old name it gave him forever, the son of Austerlitz. News travelled faster than couriers when it wanted to. In Paris the boulevards flowed as if someone had pulled a stopper. Drapers sold more blue, children drew a profile on slate, and a mason chipped the first strokes that would become an arch promised to victory. He returned through a city that staged its happiness with the competence of a regiment. He accepted the cheers like a man receiving reports, noted, appreciated, set aside for later. Prussia had been affronted by rumour and certainty both. In 1806 its army marched with the ghost of Frederick at its shoulder, and discovered that ghosts do not adjust to new tempos. At Jena he shattered their pride. At Ostend, Davout, severe, tireless, took an entire kingdom by the throat with one corps and did not boast about it. Napoleon entered Berlin quietly, as if not to wake something that might remember itself, and stood a moment by Frederick's tomb. He removed his hat not from superstition but from accuracy. He knew a lineage when he saw one. He intended to insert himself into it. The raft at Tilsit rocked gently on the Niemen while Europe held its breath like a swimmer. Tar, river water, varnish. Diplomacy has a smell when staged outdoors. He and Alexander looked at each other with the intricate regard of men who have decided to admire and to use. The words they spoke that day were polished on both sides. They divided the world the way boys divide a cake, quickly, with mutual assurances that neither is greedy. A queen in white silk asked for mercy for Prussia, and received the kind of answer that sends a nation home wounded but alive. The treaties signed on the moving floor seemed to promise that even rivers could be made to keep still. If the sea could not be forced, it might be starved. He announced a siege of an island from every port on every coast that he could cause to obey. The continental system spread like a curtain drawing across shop fronts. Bolts of cloth impounded, sugar turned from sweetness to contraband, customs men acquiring the moral weight of small tyrants. Smugglers learned new routes, dock workers learned new curses, merchants learned to pretend that necessity was principle. He had given Europe a single market by forbidding trade with a single nation. It worked on paper and in Paris. In Lisbon and Königsberg it produced ingenious exceptions. He did not mind exceptions if they were his. Vienna received him twice more, once with music as it always did, once with a worried courtesy. In 1809 the Danube shone and lied. Aspen-Essling punished him with its islands and its breakwaters. Wagram accepted the lesson of massed guns and taught him in return the price of a victory pressed too hard. He built a grand battery, a metal argument no one could shout down, and shoved the field a mile to the right. The Austrians bent, did not break, bent again. By night he was the same man he had been at Lodi, pleased and dissatisfied in the same breath, already repairing what success had damaged. Power at home required a different arithmetic. Josephine's laughter could not give him an heir. He loved her. He told himself he loved France more. The divorce was conducted as if in a chapel where the god was policy. She cried. He did not because he lacked the water, but because he had not granted himself the permission. He married Austria, the Archduchess Marie-Louise, like a treaty sealed with a dress. The wedding was an empire's self-portrait. Velvet, diamonds, an orchestra that knew when to be quiet. When the child came, tiny fists furious at first light, he held the boy close and found in himself a tenderness that frightened him more than any battle. "The King of Rome," others said. He said nothing and listened to a heartbeat that sounded like a future trying to begin. Paris performed contentment with a virtuosity that delighted even those obliged to dislike the regime. The Tuileries became a hive, ministers like precise bees bringing back pollen in the form of figures, Fouché's shadows moving where shadows should, Savry's neat reports arranging danger into paragraphs. Opera boxes glittered, salons murmured, the Legion of Honor pinned red to lapels that had been grey, roads lengthened, bridges acquired names. A column in the Place Vendôme rose from melted guns as if bronze were a tree. He walked the galleries of the Louvre, once a warehouse of monarchy, now a storeroom of conquest, and allowed himself to admire not himself but the artists who had understood how to turn stone into time. On review days the eagles rode above serried lines and veterans glanced at them the way men glance at scars they have made peace with. Drums rolled, boots bit gravel, a horse reared once and then apologized by obeying perfectly for an hour. He rode down the ranks in the old grey coat as if to remind the pageant that effectiveness had a uniform. Men who had not been born when Toulon fell looked at him and understood why their fathers still sat straighter when they heard his name. He worked late. Maps lay open like patient animals. Ministers stood for longer than their physicians advised. Secretaries learned the art of translating speed into legibility. He would touch a frontier with a fingertip and say, "Here," and a prefect would receive a letter 2 days later that began, "It has been decided." He was not omniscient. He was organized. He slept 4 hours and insisted the 5th was a luxury for civilians. From the windows of the Tuileries, Paris appeared convinced. Farther out, reality diluted. In Spain, a people who had not been consulted began to write their answer in the margins of roads. A prince he had appointed sat on a throne that pushed him back. Columns marched through gorges that tightened like hands. He called it an ulcer when he spoke sharply. When he spoke gently, he called it unfortunate. He was not yet ready to concede that the will of villagers can be a general, yet the summit held. In councils, kings who had once looked past him now measured their words against him. In the field, marshals whose names would later be given to boulevards still came at a gallop when summoned and still waited, eyes narrowed for this single instruction on which their day would pivot. In nursery and chancery both, the future looked like a sun with a title and a map coloured generously in blue. One evening, a late summer, the city faintly powdered with dust, he stood alone in a room large enough to hold a chorus. The windows were open to a measured wind. Somewhere a parade was finishing. Somewhere a censor was crossing out an adjective. Somewhere a baker was sweeping flour into tidy drifts. He put his hand on the map, not to keep it from blowing away, but to feel in his palm the mild static of an empire temporarily at rest. He knew summits. He knew their thin air, their deceptive quiet. He knew that from every high place one sees not only the horizon, but also, if one is honest, the angles of the slopes that fall away. He had no intention of descending. He turned from the window to the papers on his desk. There was always one more decree to sign, one more road to draw, one more regiment to nudge across a river on a pin's width of bridge. Outside, Paris rehearsed the lines of prosperity. Inside, he rehearsed the next move. The eagles slept in their cases. The child slept in his cradle. The city slept because someone must. He did not. He listened to the clock and for a moment mistook its ticking for the regular indifferent heartbeat of history. Then he smiled at his own superstition and bent again to work. Decline. Spain began as an adjustment and became a wound. He moved kings like bookends, Charles aside, Ferdinand aside, and set his brother on the throne as if family could do the work of consent. Madrid answered with knives and priests and the raw authority of a street. Dupont surrendered at Bailen, and for the first time in a decade French eagles watched their own march the other way. In Saragossa, people fought house by house, as if rooms had vows. Columns advanced through gorges that tightened like hands. Couriers rode into villages where the church bell was an alarm, not a summons to mass. He called it an ulcer, meaning manageable pain. It was infection. It taught Europe a plain lesson. Remove a crown by decree and you awaken a nation that never needed one. The war in the peninsula lengthened into attrition. Generals rotated through it and came back older in the eyes. The British, so often a rumour across water, planted themselves behind lines no one could see until a man ran into them, Torres Vedras like a set of invisible teeth. Wellington moved forward like a carpenter, measuring twice and cutting once. French reports began to include new phrases: ambush, convoy lost, requisitions failed, that were not the vocabulary of triumph. He sent reinforcements as if paying a debt that compounded. Meanwhile, the continental system, conceived as a net to starve an island, caught allies instead. Smugglers prospered, customs men did too. Manufacturers in Rouen and Lyon counted orders that did not arrive. Russia smiled, nodded, and opened its back door when no one looked. Alexander's friendship became a handshake held a little too long while eyes watched the exit. By 1812, the arithmetic pushed him toward the border like a hand between the shoulders. He assembled a grande armée that was no longer chiefly French. Poles with bright hopes, Italians with tidy uniforms, Germans with tidy habits, flags braided into a single wind. He looked at the map of Russia the way a physician looks at a fever chart. Lines rising, lines falling, a curve that can be forced. The Niemen parted before him like an unguarded thought. The summer air blurred distance. Magazines proved farther than their lists. Fires marched ahead of him, leaving ash where bread had been promised. Smolensk yielded heat and smoke and not much else. At Borodino, two armies tested the word decision to its breaking point. The field was labour and repetition. Redoubts taken, retaken. A church shattered to courteous rubble. Men moving as if through a thick sentence. At dusk he could claim victory as a fact and defeat as a future. The Russians retreated with their scaffolding intact. Moscow received him with fire. For days the city writhed like a book being rewritten without permission. He stood at a window in the Kremlin and understood that no letter from the Tsar would appear on the blotter. He waited because sometimes patience changes a will. He waited too long. When he left in October, the cold had started its bureaucratic work. Paperwork of frost on every surface. Delays entered in the margins of the day. Horses decreased into plank and bone. boots hardened into laws. The road back became a classroom in which the lesson never varied, and no one passed early. He owed a winter ode to courage. The pontonnier under Eblé walked into the Berezina as if water were a difficult order, and made a bridge where the river preferred none. Men crossed with the politeness of the dying, giving way because there is no other courtesy left. The old guard, reduced to embers, still warmed the air it occupied. He left the army to its hard honesty and raced to Paris when the Mallet plot revealed how thin the skin of his authority could be. He returned not to glory but to the work of recovery. New levies, new muskets, old names said with a question mark. In 1813 he fought like a man writing with the last ink in the well. He won at Lutzen and Bautzen, where youth in ill-fitting coats learned the geometry of survival too quickly. He displayed the old clarity at Dresden, rain swept aside, cannon massed as if by plumb line, and then saw the lesson turned against him. The Allied plan to avoid him and crush his marshals in detail, a strategy like a polite refusal repeated until the evening ends. At Leipzig the world came to a single field. Saxon allies switched sides mid-battle as if turning a page. The Elster Bridge blew too soon, and men who had escaped were pushed back into the water by that indifferent plume of timber and dust. He retreated across a Germany that had decided to speak in its own voice. France itself became a battlefield. In 1814 he composed a rough music of local victories, Champaubert, Montmirail, Montereau, 6 days of brilliance assembled from scraps. He confused armies with speed and exactness, as he had taught himself to do long ago in Italy. But the coalition learned to absorb surprise without breaking. Paris counted days, not hopes. Talleyrand arranged furniture and futures with equal calm. The Senate discovered that legality could be found wherever a chair was placed. He offered to abdicate in favour of his son, then simply abdicated. At Fontainebleau he said farewell to the old guard in a voice that did not tremble and a heart that did. They wept. He touched hats, coats, shoulders, as if inventorying what remained of himself. Poison failed him, or he failed it. Elba received him like a toy model of power, a small court, a small harbour, a small sovereign who could not help making roads even here. He lasted on the island as long as patience could be taught to a will like his. News drifted across the water, Bourbons mismanaging restoration with an old man's appetite, Allied cohesion loosening now that victory had spoiled into committee. He decided because decisions were his medium to return. A brig landed him at Golfe Juan. Snow lay on mountain shoulders as he walked north on the old royal road. The 1st Regiment sent to arrest him lined its muskets. He stepped forward alone and opened his coat as if to invite calm. "If you would shoot your emperor, here I am," he said to silence that became cheers. The flight of the Eagle crossed France one garrison at a time, not flown but carried on hands. Back in the Tuileries he met ministers who remembered how to bend and soldiers who did not need reminding. He spoke quickly, slept less, tried to give peace a path that avoided humiliation. Europe preferred certainty to nuance. He resolved to strike first, as always, to split opponents before they gathered. Belgium would be a hinge. He would force it. At Ligny he beat the Prussians with the old clarity, pushing them back across their own thoughts. At Quatre Bras, Ney met an enemy who refused to arrive on his schedule. A whole afternoon drained away into cornfields and courage. D'Erlon's corps marched between 2 battles as if trapped inside a mistaken sentence. The plan, fine on paper, went to pieces on roads that remembered rain. The night before Waterloo the sky ripped itself open. Dawn found fields filled with mud that clung to boots and wheels like a principle. He delayed, not by choice but because the ground delayed for him. Hougoumont took a brigade-sized appetite and then demanded another. La Haye-Sainte became a splinter in the mouth of his centre. He watched through a glass as attacks set their shoulders to the British line and leaned without quite moving it. Ney, born to bravery and to repetition, spent cavalry like small change against squares that did not forget their drill. The Prussians, who had vanished at Ligny, reappeared at Plancenoit like an argument resumed. He sent the guard at last because there was nothing else to send. They went up the slope in their old exactness, black bearskin steady as punctuation, and came down in broken grammar. A phrase went around the field that day about the guard not retreating. What mattered was that the army did. Dusk brought the soft, endless sound of collapse. He abdicated a second time, this one less an act than a concession to gravity. He considered America as an escape, and then boarded an English ship as a solution, Bellerophon, a name too elegant for what it carried. He declared himself to the British as a guest. They classified him as something between prisoner and inconvenience. The Atlantic, which had so often functioned as plot device in his story, took up its largest role and bore him away to the comma after his sentence, St. Helena. Decline is not only defeat, it is the revelation of what victory had hidden. Spain revealed that peoples make history without waiting to be invited. Russia revealed that distance is a weapon with its own doctrine. Germany revealed that coalitions learn. France revealed that a nation can love you and decide in committee to stop. He discovered in himself a stubbornness that served him until it didn't, a belief that could bully fact, a habit of centralizing decisions until the machine depended on a single pair of hands. Yet even in falling, he practiced the craft he had always believed in. The 1814 campaign remains a manual in how to think with speed. The farewell at Fontainebleau remains a lesson in bearing. The return from Elba remains proof that legend can walk faster than logistics. On a map, the blue receded. In memory, it consolidated. The ship cut its careful line through water that looked the same in every direction. He stood on deck sometimes, wrapped against wind that had no opinion. Behind him, Paris arranged a new government. Ahead, an island developed the patience to be his last address. He had worn a crown and a grey coat, slept in palaces and in tents, argued with kings and with algebra. Now he would argue with time. The horizon did not answer, but he had never required an answer to begin speaking. Epilogue. Longwood House had grown quiet in a way that was not only weather. The wind still worked the shutters. The sea kept up its slow grammar against the rocks. The willows he'd planted finally made a small shade that moved across the grass like a thoughtful hand. Inside, the rooms had narrowed to essentials: a bed, a chair, a table with papers that no longer expected to become orders. He had been busy with last things. He dictated a will that sounded less like a reckoning than like a set of instructions to a future he still insisted on addressing. He asked that his bones rest one day by a certain river among a certain people, as if burial were another maneuver that could be staged correctly or poorly. He sorted medals, books, trinkets that had survived more campaigns than some men, and gave them away with a care that suggested logistics more than sentiment. He said small practical things to Marchand and Bertrand because practicality was the faith he had kept longest. Pain was a conversation that would not learn its manners. Between its sentences he visited rooms he had already described to himself 1,000 times. A courtyard at Brienne with powder-dry snow, a plank bridge at Lodi, a grey morning at Austerlitz when fog yielded on command, a long gallery at Fontainebleau where a farewell echoed against polished wood. Memory, as he had told the page, was a battlefield. Today, it favoured no one. It received what came, victories that looked like clean lines, defeats that looked like torn fabric, and laid them side by side without judgment. He slept and woke and slept again. He asked for tea he did not drink. He handled a small map because paper obeyed when men did not. When fever pulled him under, he surfaced speaking in nouns: a country, an army, a woman's name said with the economy he had never managed in life. Outside, the willows made their thin sound, unresolved as a question. On the day itself, the sky did nothing theatrical. Wind, a few gulls, light that had crossed half a planet without thinking about it. He exhaled once as if setting down a weight. Those around him bowed their heads because grief requires an action. The house, suddenly too large for its remaining purpose, put its furniture in the attitude of absence. They carried him down into the valley he had pointed out, and the island practiced its old art of indifference. The grave took the shape it had been given. Stones consented. Water went on with its argument below. The willows, guileless, offered exactly the shade he had asked them to offer. A small ceremony said a large name. The earth kept it, because that is what earth does. Years multiplied. The island went back to being a place on maps rather than a sentence in newspapers. Then a ship came, careful and black, and the will he had written began to work on geography. Men lifted a lid under trees that had learned his sound. Faces looked down and then away, each seeing what he had brought with him. The coffin went aboard. Sails made their old civilized noises. The Atlantic practiced returning. Paris received what it had lost with a precision learned over centuries. Bells behaved, uniforms fit. A cold air made breath look like visible consent. A barge took the river slowly, because slowness is how grief believes itself. Crowds placed silence where shouts would have been easier. He passed beneath bridges that did not exist when he had first learned this city, and children were lifted for a better view of a story they already knew how to retell. In the Church of Soldiers, under a dome that turned sound into ceremony, stone arranged itself around a name that required little embellishment. The city filed past, and found in itself a posture it had not needed for some time. What remained did not reside there entirely. Laws remained. Articles written in a prose that preferred clarity to eloquence, still recited in classrooms where boys in cheap coats sit up because a sentence is a kind of parade. Roads remained, and the habit of building them straight. Schools remained, and the expectation that a state should be legible to its citizens. In marble, victories stood as if time had stopped on their best afternoon. In ledgers, reforms performed their small daily triumphs without trumpet. On boulevards that would one day bear the names of marshals, shopkeepers haggled in a piece purchased by men who'd been trained to salute. Arguments remained too, because arguments are what nations keep when they do not keep wars. Was he liberator or jailer, lawgiver or arsonist, genius or gambler with other men's breath? The case for each could be made from the same set of facts, rearranged like pieces on a table he would have recognized. In Spain, a grave of their own remembering. In Russia, a road that will not forget. In Germany, a lesson written in coalition ink. In France, a portrait that changes expression as each generation looks up at it. The soldiers aged. The eagles slept in museums on a velvet approximation of loyalty. Veterans taught their grandchildren how to stand while telling a story. The grandchildren practiced the trick of believing and doubting in the same minute. Scholars argued over commas in dispatches and found in those commas their own careers. Tourists took pictures of a tomb that had been designed to make ankles remember the act of descending. A student of law, bored then startled, discovered in an article about property the cold elegance of a mind that understood how power behaves when you take the uniforms off it. And on the island, where the wind keeps its job and history does not visit unless invited, the willows grew wider. Their shade, once a narrow dial, became a modest clock. The sea made its old case and withdrew it, as if rehearsing for a trial that would never be held. Longwood leaned, paint peeled, a caretaker tied a stubborn shutter with a length of rope. Sometimes a man walked the slope and stopped where grass refuses to forget a rectangle. He looked toward a horizon that does not answer, and thought the thoughts that horizons ask for, about beginning, about end, about maps folded carefully after use. He had once said, he had once ordered, that history is not a verdict but a summons. Even if he did not say it aloud, he behaved as if it were true. He summoned armies and ministries, loyalty and paperwork, genius and bad luck. He summoned a century into an outline it had not intended to assume. When the summons ended, the century did not quite relax. It kept the posture it had learned. What do we do with him now? We read him, we root around him, we repeat him badly. We cross bridges he placed on maps and forget to notice. We argue in his shadow without admitting we like the cool. We measure ourselves against his best days and warn ourselves with his worst. We discover again and again that will is a tool but not a god, that nations obey until they don't, that law, for all its plainness, is the more durable victory. On certain mornings in Paris the light hits stone in a way that makes it look newly decided. Somewhere a boy in a grey coat opens a book and finds his name not in the index but in the argument. Somewhere a woman in Ajaccio buys figs and does not think of August in a year-long past. Somewhere the river moves under a bridge and is called by an old name, and under the dome a tourist whispers without meaning to. Somewhere a willow hisses and no one hears the sentence it finishes. The map is folded, the sentence ends, the work goes on.